Good evening, national readers. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I am joined by our fantastic Foreign Affairs editor, David Pratt, to discuss some of the biggest news stories of the year in global politics and around the world. To be honest, we could spend the next half an hour, 40 minutes just talking about news from the past week. There's so much going on. But we thought that it would be a good idea to round up just how significant a year it has been in international affairs as we approach the end of 2024. So thank you so much for joining me tonight, David.
No problem at all, Laura.
So I think we should probably start by talking about Syria, because this is what everyone has been talking about this week. I don't know if you want to sort of catch people up on the developments. Everything's been moving exceptionally quickly. Where are we and what is coming next, I suppose?
Well, I think it would be difficult to understate just how seismic actually the whole situation in Syria is. I mean, it's not only re-landscaped the geopolitics of the Middle East, it's in effect had a knock-on effect to the global geopolitical situation as well. I think there's incredible uncertainty right now in Syria. I mean, I wrote about this in the paper earlier in the week, and I was referencing Libya when I covered the revolution there when Gaddafi was overthrown, which was immediately followed by incredible euphoria, as well as a little bit of apprehension, but mainly euphoria. And of course, rather rapidly, it descended into something pretty nasty and pretty bad. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that that's going to happen in Syria. I think to some extent the Syrian people are weary. I actually have more confidence in this interim leader, if I can call him that, in Abu Muhammad Jalani and the HTS than perhaps some people do. Yes, I know he was affiliated with ISIS. I know he was affiliated with Al Qaeda and was a jihadist in that sense. But I genuinely think that he has turned a new leaf in that way. He's been fighting against ISIS and Al Qaeda. And I think he's a canny, astute operator, very, very sophisticated. He's shown that in the way that he's handled the political situation, not just the military situation, but the political situation. So for the time being, I'm kind of slightly reassured about that. And I hope that turns out to be the case for the Syrian people themselves. What I'm more concerned about is the situation that inevitably seems to blight so many Middle Eastern countries, and that is outside interference, both regional and international. And I think, if anywhere, that's where Syria's problems might lie in the near future.
I mean, just as we've been speaking, there's been some comments coming through, and people seem to be quite concerned about the situation with Israel bombing in Syria at the moment. And there's some concern maybe that the new leader hasn't done enough about Israel's, what they're calling an invasion. Would you agree with that? Do you think that's a fair piece of analysis?
Well, I think there's two things to say here, and I think probably listeners and readers of the National know that I'm certainly no apologist for Israel. But I'm putting a very forensic kind of strategic hat on in what I'm about to say here. Now, if you were sitting in some command headquarters in Israel right now, and you saw what was happening in Syria, then as a military person, you would take this opportunity to do everything you could, frankly, to decapitate, castrate, neuter, you call it what you want, the threat that always has been perceived to come from Syria. Now, whether that was through proxies like Hezbollah or whether it be through the armed forces of the government itself, this is Israel's one and only opportunity to do that, as they see it. I stress, as they see it. Hence, their tanks rolling up to within 16 miles of Damascus, hence the attacks on naval installations, and most importantly, the attacks on weapons stockpiles, particularly chemical weapons stockpiles, because the Israelis will be very, very nervous that those weapons, and indeed we all should be nervous, that those weapons could fall into the hands of ISIS or Al Qaeda, which still operates within the country in reasonable numbers. Now, that's me with my forensic Israeli military strategic hat on. Where I feel very uncomfortable at what Israel is doing is that they're in the process of land grabbing wherever they can. And if that creates a buffer, we've seen that in Lebanon. If that's what they're trying to do in Syria, it will be much the same sort of processes we've seen in Lebanon itself. But I think people need to, it's easy to condemn. And I condemn. I mean, I all I've done this year is condemn Israel's actions, whether it be in Beirut, in Lebanon, whether it be obviously in Gaza or whatever. But you have to try, as an analyst, look through the perspective, look through the optic, the Israeli optic in that sense. As for Syria's reaction to it, I think, to be honest, in any kind of immediate post-revolutionary situation where they've just toppled, a regime that has been in existence for decades, that I think the Syrian, I think Jolani and the HTS and others are rather preoccupied with other things at the moment in that sense. And frankly, there's not an awful lot they can do about what Israel is doing, So there's a realpolitik here. And again, I think that's where Jolani is quite astute. He's not trying to make a bad situation worse here. On the contrary, he's trying to reassure both Syrians and I think the international community in that way. Where I'd get very worried is if the Israelis continued to move forward and forward and forward. But there's no way they're going to try and occupy Syria. I mean, that's militarily out of the question in that sense.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much, David. So one of the things that's come up this week in the coverage of Syria is the fact that the Home Office has put a pause on asylum applications from Syria. And so for those watching, that doesn't just mean those who are considering coming over from Syria now. That means people who are already in the UK, who's hoping for their asylum applications to be processed, are now facing a pause. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on what you think that means for people from Syria in the UK. And do you think that they will be rushing to go home? Do you think that it's as simple as that? I'm just curious because, in your time, you will have met lots of people from Syria who will have lots of different views about what has happened to their country.
Well, I cast my mind back to, and doing a story that I did some years back and followed Syrian refugees all the way from Syria, from the border itself, down through Turkey, through Gaziantep, down to Bodrum, and then across to the Greek islands where they were trying to make their way further into Europe. One particular family that I met trying to get to Germany, another trying to get to Switzerland where they had relatives. So I'm more than familiar with the stories of people that have attempted to come here, and many of them lost their life actually in the course of doing so. I think the decision by the UK government and indeed other European governments to kind of suspend the visa applications or asylum applications, put them into this kind of, suspended animation, if you like, is absolutely deplorable. It's deplorable and it's premature because we don't know the political trajectory that Syria will be going in. So, they paused this, and for all we know, it could take a very nasty turn very quickly. Events have been happening so fast on the ground. Now, if that were the case, then we could have another wave of people leaving Syria. And so I think the many Syrians will be wary about returning. And I think those that have left need to be treated with due process in that sense. I think it's appalling. I mean, part of the issue here as well is I think we must realize that in great part, one of the reasons that we're in this situation is that the West has contributed considerably to it. I mean, there was a fantastic piece in the Financial Times a few days ago by Kim Gattas, the veteran Beirut-based correspondent. And she was saying, if you look at the way Syria changed the world, and it did, the Syrian war changed the world, not just in terms of generating one of the biggest refugee crises that we've seen in modern times, but that in itself had a knock-on effect here in Europe and elsewhere, but particularly here in Europe, because it triggered far-right reaction. It triggered the creation and the endorsement of many far-right positions in that way, arguably even, contributed to Brexit in a certain way. So what happened there and the West's kind of incompetency in handling that situation, if it handled it sooner, better in that way, we may have not have had these problems here in Europe itself. So I think to behave prematurely in the idea that, oh, we just get them all back there. That's not to say that a lot of Syrians don't want to return. One of the things that always struck me, actually, when I was in Turkey and in neighboring and in Lebanon or wherever, was, and it's the case with so many refugees around the world, they move over a border. They want to be as close to home as possible. This rather misguided notion that they're here for rather spurious motives, and want to stay here and just glean everything they can from it, is totally inaccurate. And we're seeing that with the numbers of people that are returning from Syria and from Lebanon at the moment, albeit very brave for doing so, given the uncertainty in the future. But I think the suspension of those visas is premature and rather misguided, to be honest.
I was at an event on, I think, Tuesday, where there was a woman whose application had been suspended, and she just had no idea what was going to happen next for her. And it did sort of make you think that, just because a country is no longer officially led by a dictator or officially at war, it doesn't actually mean that place is immediately safe anymore. Like, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, again, referring to that Kim Gata's piece, she said, who would have thought it was so simple? You get rid of a dictator and people want to go home. I mean, perhaps there's a lesson there for the West, and I know there'll be a whole school of thought out there saying, well, it's the usual, the West is to blame for this. And I think the West has handled the whole situation in the Middle East by and large pretty appallingly. I mean, let's be candid about that. Our own country, particularly in relation to other areas like Gaza or like Lebanon or whatever. And the big fear, I think, now is that in Syria that we double down in that incompetency. And I do fear for the country in that sense that the external players, if I can call them that. I mean, obviously, I've explained what I think Israel is doing. There's a very clear geostrategic motive there. But take Turkey, for example. Erdogan's government has very unfinished business with the Kurds in the northeast of Syria, who he deems to be a threat. He sees the elements within the Syrian Democratic Front as being linked to PKK and Kurdish separatist movements. So he will be doing everything he can with his own militias. And let's remember that a lot of these Syrian militias, so-called Syrian militias, are in fact wholly backed by Turkey in that sense. And to be perfectly honest, there's an awful lot of them. I've got some rather unsavory people amongst them. People watching this may be thinking, oh, well, has Jolani changed these spots? Has the leopard changed these spots? Has he moved from being a jihadist? Well, I can tell you one thing. One thing that hasn't changed is that Turkey continues to back militias who have members of ISIS within their ranks. Footage came out just a few days ago after the taking of Deir ez-Zor near the Euphrates River in the east of the country. And at checkpoints there on the uniforms were arm patches of what were meant to be the Syrian National Army, but in actual fact, we caught glimpses of the fact that they were indeed ISIS members. Erdogan has no compulsion using, no reluctance to use Islamists to pursue his agenda in Syria. And that agenda is primarily aimed at neutralizing what he sees as the Kurdish threat in the east. So it's that kind of external interference, which brings us to the United States. 900 or so, 900 troops in the east of the country supporting the SDF, mainly Kurdish. What's going to happen when Trump comes in January? Is he going to pull those American troops out? Is he going to leave the SDF on their own, unsupported by America, allowing ISIS to rise up again, and indeed allowing Turkey free reign in the area? There's so many uncertainties at the moment, Laura,
Definitely. And I mean, you've touched on Trump there, so I feel like that would be a good segue for us to talk about one of the other biggest news stories of the year, which was Donald Trump winning the election. I mean, where are we now? Obviously, he's president-elect. He's going to become president in January. What does this mean for America on the global stage, and what does it mean for the citizens of America?
Well, I think that let's take the citizens of America first. I mean, it was an overwhelming victory. We can't deny that. Trump is back because enough Americans love him and want him back. Let's be absolutely upfront about this. There's no point in denying it. It's also a kind of a rather sobering reminder that we should be very wary of polls, whether they be polls about Scottish independence or whether they be about polls about who's going to be the next president of the United States. Be wary of polls, I suppose, is the election. The lesson from the election that we learned from the United States.
Yes.
I think that doesn't mean to say that I don't worry for the United States, because I think it remains deeply, deeply polarized. I worry about some of the legislation and the policies that Trump will implement domestically, particularly on migrants and that kind of thing. And frankly, within our own industry, because I think there's a kind of retribution coming down the chute in the direction of the American press. And I know many American colleagues are very, very nervous about this. And a lot of media watchdogs and monitoring groups are nervous, because if we know one thing there's two things we know about Trump, the one predictable thing about him is his unpredictability. And the other thing is that he's a guy who does not forgive and forget easily. And I think many people will feel the backlash, both politically, but within the media as well in the United States. And I know many of my American colleagues are bracing themselves for what could be quite serious stuff. I mean, new legislation, restrictions on reporting, arrests for reporting certain types of events, shutting down potentially. These things are all being openly discussed within the American media right now. People here might not be aware of it, but there is certain fear of it. Now, that's just the domestic situation. If we get Trump into the international arena, here I'm equally concerned about his unpredictability, because we don't know what he will do. But what I do think is that, that unpredictability is an asset and a strength, and he knows it. He knows that whether it be Kim Jong-un, whether it be Vladimir Putin, whoever it is, whether it be, the new president, Pezeshkian of Iran, or Khamenei, or whatever, he knows that these people fear him in a sense that they fear his unpredictability. They don't know which way he will jump. There's no kind of orthodoxy to his foreign policy arrangements, even if he does have some previous heavy hitters within his forthcoming administration. And I think the same can be said of his handling of Russia and Ukraine, because that's going to be very, very interesting very quickly. There's a lot of nervousness, obviously, in Ukraine about that.
Yeah, I think I wanted to ask you about that as well, specifically Trump's kind of impact on Ukraine and also Trump's impact on Gaza. So let's first talk about Trump's impact on Ukraine. What's the kind of political attitude in the US right now to continuing to support Ukraine?
Well, I think the Trump, if the Wall Street Journal is correct in the last few weeks and their information, and they're usually pretty accurate about these things, and they had very good contacts and leaks from the Trump transition team, 3 sources apparently, who indicated that what the Americans and what the Trump administration has in mind is the creation of a demilitarized zone in Ukraine. Now, that's working in the assumption that, of course, Kiev and President Zelensky and others are actually agreeable to that. But what that demilitarized zone would entail would be a 700-mile front line frozen, and then a policing of that demilitarized zone. Now, here comes the rub, because the one thing they've made clear is that there will be no American boots on the ground, and America will not police that arrangement. The Americans have said that they will also, or the Trump administration transition team have said, they will also not support any US-funded body to help police it. And I'm paraphrasing the quote from the source at the Wall Street Journal, but they said, we want the Poles, the Brits, the Germans, and the French to police that demilitarized zone. And I quote, it's their gun barrels which should be pointing in the direction of Russia. Now, that is quite an alarming statement. And I think many people here in Europe would be getting a bit fidgety about that thought, But actually, if it helps bring peace to the war, or at least a ceasefire and calms things down, then that's not necessarily a bad thing, provided that the Ukrainians and Zelensky is on board there. And this is where I think the Europeans are very, very important, because one of the things that has to happen is we have to have a seat during the brokering of that deal, should they take that shape of a demilitarized zone. if that deal is brokered simply between Putin and Trump, then I fear for Ukrainians. I mean, Europe cannot afford not to have a seat at the table in those negotiations. And it may have to step up to the plate with some of that policing arrangement. And indeed, some foreign ministers in Central and Eastern Europe, including the Estonian foreign minister, recently made that very point, that Europe needs to step up to the plate. So provided that happens, it could provide an off-ramp and a de-escalation and perhaps a move towards peace. So, on the one hand, their knees are knocking at the prospect of Donald Trump coming in. On the other hand, it could break a kind of logjam process that might lead positively in that direction. But I stress, the man is unpredictable, as we know.
Absolutely. So what is the morale like in Ukraine at the moment? Obviously, it's going to be year 3 of this war when we get to March. March, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, we're a few years in now, and it'll be another significant anniversary. How are people in Ukraine feeling, and what is the attitude towards the war there now?
Well, every time I've gone back, particularly in recent times, I've noticed, it's beleaguered. You physically notice it on the streets of Kiev and other Ukrainian cities. The physical manifestations of war are there. Limbless people, wounded soldiers, the movement. There is a demeanor of knowing that their backs are to the wall, and the winters are always very bleak there, so that doubles down on it. And Putin, obviously, it strategically makes use of that by hitting the energy infrastructure and whatever. So I think there is a war weariness, but there's still a dogged determination. And they know that whatever happens here, even if a deal is done, a deal has to be done that doesn't just completely drop them in the deep end. There has to be something that Ukrainians get out of this. So the morale is I think, has been eroded somewhat. They're short of personnel, men and women, to fight on the front lines. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And they're worried about the kind of the continuation or not of American support in the future, or indeed European support in that way. So it's going to be a very testing and trying time in the early part of the new year. But we'll have, I think, early indications the moment Trump takes office. And going back to Trump, as you were asking about his position over Gaza, for example, I'm less, how do I put it? I'm less confident or optimistic that there's a potential for anything positive there. I think, given the absolute horrors, as we know, that the people of Gaza have been through, and Palestinians generally, both there and in the West Bank, I see things being very, very bleak for the foreseeable future, because Trump is just too closely plugged in with the Netanyahu. I mean, he and Netanyahu, by all accounts, don't personally get on very well. But that doesn't mean to say that from a policy level that they will be singing off the same hymn sheet. I think that is undoubtedly the case. I mean, just look back over Trump's previous administration and what he did there, the movement of the capital to the embassy to Jerusalem and stuff. He's very, very plugged in, and I think Netanyahu has been playing for time. He saw this coming. It's no surprise that the Israeli press themselves, the Daily Haaretz newspaper, commented on this not so long ago, that Israelis were almost to a person voting for or hoping for a Trump victory for precisely those reasons. So I think the Palestinians are inconceivable as it is, an even stickier place than they have been for the last 18 months or nearly 2 years now. It's terrible. The future, what they face.
It is. It's appalling. We have a question on this very topic from Mark on Facebook, who's asking, why doesn't the UN send in a peacekeeping force, boots on the ground, to facilitate some of the urgent aid and medical supplies needed in Gaza? The West's response so far has been pathetic.
The West's response so far has been not so much pathetic, but actually deplorable, because it continues to supply the weapons that Israeli used to decimate the entire area. As for the UN, well, the UN's got its huge limitations. I mean, the structural incapacity of the UN Security Council, and the way it's structured with American influence there and people being able to veto certain decisions. If it were only that simple, whereby a vote could be taken and you would be able to send in the peacekeeping troops, that would be wonderful. But both the structural capacity of the UN does not allow that to happen. The political interests of those that frankly pull the major reins at the UN don't allow that to happen. And frankly, Israel wouldn't allow it to happen, whatever we may think of that, simply because they feel they have unfinished business there in that sense. And you can see on a daily basis in Gaza itself the physical impact of that. I mean, that we speak about genocide. Everybody recognizes it's genocide. I mean, I was absolutely, if I can just, as an aside, watching that footage recently of Sir Keir Starmer in wig and gown when he was a human rights lawyer.
Yeah.
Talking about a city that is now in Croatia that I know well because I was one of the last journalists to leave the city or the town of Vukovar back in 1991 at that time. And Starmer was a human rights lawyer, and there is video footage of him recently talking about a genocide being enacted in Vukovar. Now, Vukovar was a town of about 40,000 people. And I'm not to diminish what happened there, because it was truly horrendous when the Serbs and the Yugoslav National Army went in, the atrocities that were committed, the levels of devastation, it eviscerated the town. I returned just a year or so ago to visit the town, and it's rebuilt, but the wounds are still there. But Keir Starmer is on the record. People can look up that Google footage of him demanding that this be recognized as a genocide, but he has steadfastly refused, as David Lammy has, another lawyer, to recognize a genocide that's taking place in Gaza. It baffles me why that is happening, other than the fact that clearly he's upset about, or he's worried about upsetting Netanyahu, and obviously the UK government continues to make money from it in that sense.
Why haven't we stopped arms sales?
Because I think it makes money. Frankly, that's the bottom line. I mean, it's these kind of, casting back even to the beginning of our discussion here, even with Syria and whatever. These are the people that benefit from these situations. All these outside, power players. It's not the people in Syria. It's not the people in Gaza we should be worried about in that sense. It's the people who see the opportunity to make money from these situations and can continue to do so. I cast back to Libya. I remember, many of the Libyans that went into exile when they fled during the revolution before Gaddafi was toppled. As is often the case in many countries, usually it's the wealthy that go first because they can afford to do so. And many of them were politicians who rubbed shoulders with other politicians and people within the defense establishment, big industry, and all kinds of deals are done in diaspora terms before these people return to the country, and then they carve a piece of the action for themselves. Now that happens on a behind the scenes basis, and it happens on an upfront basis. That's why we continue to, or why we don't stop sending arms there, because it makes the UK money. Simple.
I was reading recently the very short book on Palestine by Noam Chomsky and Ilan Pappé, and in that they're talking about whether it's a similar situation to South Africa, where South Africa was happy to be a pariah state so long as it had the support of the major Western powers,
yes,
of the UK and the US specifically. Do you think that is the same situation, and that if the US and the UK actually did sort of stand up, something could really be done?
I think there are real parallels there. I know Ilan Pappé. I've met him on a number of occasions, and he's one of the great voices, I think, about that situation. I'm less convinced these days about Mr. Chomsky's kind of arguments, although some of his stuff has come to fruition of late. But I think the parallels with, and again, it's someone who worked heavily with the anti-apartheid movement. I think I recognise the parallels there and have recognised them for a very long time. There's one. I think if the major powers did actually completely turn their back and can, I mean, but how much more do you make Israel a pariah state than it is right now in global terms, unless you're looking at it through Trumpian eyes or whatever the case may be? It already is a pariah state. But there's another very significant difference, I think, between South Africa of that era and Israel now. And it's something that I understand, having lived and worked, and particularly lived and spent time in Israel when I was a correspondent there. And that is the kind of mindset that prevails within certain elements of the Israeli body politic, which is damn the world. We don't care what you think about what we do. We will do it anyway. And that is the current thinking there at the moment. So even if, I know there's a lot of people say, well, if we stop selling them arms, Israel would not be able to do what it's doing. Well, it would continue to do it. It might not do it with such ruthless efficiency, but it would continue to do it nonetheless. That is the Israeli mindset. I don't think the capacity in South Africa was quite the same in that way, but there are obvious parallels between the two.
It is. It's a very interesting comparison to discuss. So, in the meantime, while the UK continues supporting Israel, what can people watching this live stream do to help the people in Gaza?
I think what they've been doing already. I mean, getting on the streets, signing the petitions, badgering their politicians. We've no stone unturned in terms of what we can do to bring pressure to bear on Israel. Even though I've just said that the Israelis, there's almost a degree to which elements within Israel welcome this, because this whole victimhood kind of narrative that Israel has built around it because of Jewish history or whatever is something that some people within Israel actually thrive on. But that doesn't mean to say they're not affected by it. And also, I think we should give credit to many, many Israelis who are not too happy with the Netanyahu set up anyway, and would love nothing better than to see the back of him and the back of the kind of ultra-nationalist zealots that he has as a cabal around him that are forcing this on at the moment. So in terms of those people listening to this or watching, do continue to do more of what we've been doing. Double down on it in that sense. No question about it. We have to double down. And particularly here in the UK, I think, because, let's be honest about it. I mean, Starmer's position and the government's position on this has been truly, truly abysmal, as it has been in so many things of late, And I think that's where we can bring pressure to bear. It's slightly different, I think, in the United States, given the massive influence of the Zionist lobby there and the way in which they have tentacles into power structures like the APAC and organizations like that. And the fact that they have an inbound, a president-elect who will be very sympathetic to them. It's going to be very, very tricky. But we need to, I think, certainly here in Europe, and that collision, I think, over something like Gaza or Ukraine or other issues is something we need to watch in 2025. I think Europe and the United States, that relationship, be it over NATO, be it over specific instances of policy, foreign policy, is going to be tested to the extreme, a relationship with, I don't mean, when I say we, I don't mean necessarily the United Kingdom, but I said with the European relationship.
Well, David, if you'll give me 5 more minutes of your time, I have a
couple sure, yes.
I'd like to ask about. So the first thing is, you just touched on the kind of anti-Netanyahu community out in Israel. Do you think we could expect to hear more from them in 2025? I feel like a lot of people have been disappointed by the lack of voices within Israel kind of calling out the actions of the Israeli state.
I get the frustration, and I've heard, including colleagues and friends of mine who've said, "Oh, come on, David, it's all very well you saying that there are good eggs in Israel, if there were that many good eggs, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in right now." And to some extent, that is true. And rather depressingly, I think the Israelis have, the Israeli people themselves, and this is something that Netanyahu has orchestrated. Gaza was a really touchy issue. The issue of the hostages after October 7th remains a sore point, an open wound, really, in the Israeli population. But Netanyahu has rather cleverly structured, the war in Lebanon in particular, I think, has enabled him to rally the country around him, and there are a lot of people that were perhaps quite critical of him in those big street demonstrations that we saw in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem a year or so ago, or whatever, 2 years ago, that are now kind of backing him again because of what he's been doing against Hezbollah, and particularly up in the borders with Lebanon itself. So, the Israelis really need to step up to the plate here. I find it very depressing too. And again, talking about within our own profession, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are pressures on Haaretz because of its position as a daily newspaper. It's a kind of liberal, left-leaning newspaper in Israel for those unfamiliar with it, and has taken a hugely courageous stance throughout the war in Gaza and elsewhere, particularly its columnists and its analysts. And the Netanyahu government has really been putting tremendous pressure on it, which has been to some extent rallying the Israeli journalistic community, who are really worried about free speech and whatever being suppressed even further in Israel at the moment. I in all the years I spent both living there, when I say living there, based as a correspondent and visiting it, I always felt that Israel had the potential to be really, really very, very nasty, because I saw its nastiness firsthand, but nothing on the scale that we're actually witnessing right now. And the sadness is that the civilian population have been going along with it. Whole swathes of them. There's not enough of them standing up against it. But I still think that when the dust is settled, quite literally, and I hate that to use that term, but in Gaza and frankly in Lebanon at the moment, and now that we've seen what's happening in Syria, once Israel begins to take its foot off the gas, if I can put it that way, in terms of its confrontation with the axis of resistance as it's known, once all of that calms down somewhat, I think an awful lot of the Israeli population will pick up the baton where they left off. And I've always said that I think Netanyahu will be toast politically in the future. It's the damage you can do in the interim that troubles me more than anything else.
Yes, it's very concerning times. And just speaking about it, it is really emotional because we've done so much coverage over the past year plus, and the stories that we've encountered and the really horrific tales that
I think the paper's done a remarkable job. I'm not just blowing around trumpets here, but I really do. I think because there are so many people that are really very much concerned about the way in which the media handles this story. And, I'm proud to be part of a newspaper that has taken a very alternative and very different approach to that.
Yeah, thank you. We're very proud to have you. So the feeling goes both ways. And I suppose just to finalize this, and I'm sure we could have spoken for literally hours and hours of more time because we didn't get a chance to really touch on Lebanon, for instance, and there's so many other things that have happened around the world. I mean, French government falling apart.
Yes.
So much going on, but I think.
Well, my worry is about that European weakness, because at precisely the moment that tension between Washington and Europe will mount over global affairs and foreign policy in the coming year, precisely when the Trump presidency comes in, Europe's looking particularly vulnerable. So it has to give itself a boot up the backside, frankly, and start thinking about where it's going and how it's handling itself if it's going to confront. It's got enough problems on its doorstep before even tackling what Trump may be bringing its way in the forthcoming year.
Absolutely. I suppose just to wrap everything up, I would be interested what you think on this kind of question. How engaged do you think people are in global news in 2024 going into 2025? Are you concerned that people are maybe checking out because of the extreme amount of conflict around the world? Or do you think that there's an opportunity for journalists like yourself to find new audiences and be heard among the disinformation online?
I think in the 40 years that I've been covering foreign affairs, there are always those people who, a kind of compassion fatigue clicks in. Or, I've had conversations, the proverbial taxi driver conversation that everybody has from time to time. He says, I just don't watch the news anymore. I don't read the news anymore because it's all so depressing and there's terrible things happening. Well, that's fine. If people want to take that attitude, so be it, right? But you can't then, blame, the shape or tone of a government if you turn your back or bury your head in the sand over these kinds of issues. It's incumbent upon us all, I think, to pay attention to that. And I do think that, foreign affairs goes through patches where people, particularly in the Middle East, which is complicated. I mean, Syria is, even by Middle Eastern standards, is immensely complicated. And I think people kind of tune out with that. But overall, I feel there is a re-engagement. I think people are aware of the dangerous times in which we live. I'm just old enough, I know you won't believe this, but I'm just old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'm sure some of the people watching this are of a similar age. And I remember as a child not knowing what was going on, but my parents being absolutely terrified about that. You know, that was when the world was facing a nuclear catastrophe. Now, if you look at the so-called doomsday clock, it's closer to midnight than it was in 1962 or 63 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We live in a world that is not simply polarized between the communist Warsaw Pact and East and the capitalist West. It's much more fractured, much more dangerous, much more volatile, and inhabited by people, frankly, that are much more mercenary than the kind of two simple opposing sides. You think back to Cuba during that time. Khrushchev on one side, John F. Kennedy on the other. Both were men who'd experienced war. Khrushchev defended Stalingrad, JFK in a motor torpedo boat in the Pacific. Goodness me, these were guys that understood what war really means and what it means when they make political decisions that can take us into that terrible trajectory, But there's an awful lot of people inhabiting the political space right now who do not know the consequences of the decisions that they make. So I think it's more important than ever for journalists that we actually remind our readers or listeners about what is going on in the world. And I find a lot of them engaging with us in a way that perhaps they haven't done for some considerable time. I always think back to 9/11. A bunch of guys sitting in a cave in the Tora Bora mountains of Afghanistan changed the way we live. We go to airports and there's new security. They changed the kind of the geopolitical landscape. A bunch of people sitting up in the mountains in Afghanistan. Now, it's important that people understand that things like that happening that might seem far and distant and removed from their lives impact on us all. And right now we are in perhaps the most dangerous period, I think, globally than I can remember in the 4 decades that I've covered foreign affairs. And it's important for every one of us to both realize that and keep up to speed and hopefully put pressure on our politicians to make better decisions on our behalf.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that, David.
My pleasure.
Very good.
Can I just wish everyone a peaceful and happy Christmas, despite my doomsday kind of message there. And let's hope that 2025 is an awful lot better than certainly what the last year or two has been.
Yes, absolutely. I'll finish by just letting you know, this very nice comment has just come in for you, David, and from Helen, who says, this has been an excellent summation by David Pratt. I hope we hear more of this. It's even more important than ever that we have a media which is more in tune with the public. So thank you very much for that, Helen. That's very nice of you to say.
Great. Thank you, Helen.
I'm sure you'll hear from David again very soon. Well, you'll be in the Sunday paper this week and then again in the Thursday paper. I always get confused and say it's Wednesday because I'm used to reading the column on a Wednesday. And so I always tell people the wrong day, but Thursday paper, definitely. You'll be able to read all of David's wonderful analysis. And yeah, we'll maybe give you an update in the new year once we have some more to talk about.
Thanks very much, Laura.
Brilliant. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Cheers
Bye
now.
now.